Alright, and welcome back to the Cyclonic Thrift channel. We've got an exciting new budget deck tech for you today, with a new commander out of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan set that just came out recently. As always, budget deck tech, all these cards are under $1, except for the commander itself. But without further ado, let's get right into it. The commander we'll be looking at today is the Ancient One. It's a blue and a black. It's 2 mana for legendary creature, Spirit God. It's an 8/8, and it has Descend 8. The Ancient One can't attack or block unless there are 8 or more permanent cards in your graveyard. And then you pay 2 for a blue and a black to draw a card, then discard a card. When you discard a card this way, target player mills cards equal to its mana value. So when I first saw this commander, my immediately thought was Shorakai, actually. A absolutely massive 8/8 low mana cost commander that can't attack, immediately, but has a really fun ability where you can get a lot of value from it. And yeah, I think there's a lot of potential here for a self-milling deck, and that's the type of deck that I've built for you today. So essentially what we want to do is we want to mill ourselves, get as many permanents into our graveyard as possible, get Ancient One out early-ish, so that we can take advantage of its 8/8 attacking right away. We want to take advantage of payoffs when we're able to mill ourselves, and we're going to have some big beaters in this deck. Cards that can mill us for 8, 9, 15 at a time, depending on if we get the right cards. But yeah, without further ado, let's jump into some of the cards that are going to allow us to do some really fun stuff with our graveyard. The first one here is Deranged Assistant. It's 1 and a blue, creature, human, wizard, a 1/1. You tap it to mill a card and add a colorless. So right off the bat, does 2 things we want perfectly. Mills us, and it ramps us, adds us mana. Because, again, with playing some pretty massive spells in this deck to maximize on the Ancient One's payoffs, we're going to need a lot of mana to be able to cast those spells down the road. The second card here is Sands of Delirium. It's a 3 mana artifact, and you pay X and tap it. Target player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Super simple. It's really a mana dump, right? If you've got 2, 3 extra mana lying around on someone's end step, don't have anything else to do with it, go ahead and mill yourself. It'll add up over the game. And then the last card we've got here is Angel of Suffering. It's 3 and 2 black for a creature, Nightmare Angel, 5/3. Has flying, and if damage would be dealt to you, prevent that damage and mill twice that many cards. I love this card. Not only 5 mana cost, it'll fit into the Ancient One's ability a little bit. It'll be a bit of a payoff. But its ability, once we get it on the field, is something that is going to absolutely win us games. To prevent people from dealing damage to us, and at the same time filling our graveyard, which is what we want to do. It's a combination that a lot of opponents and the decks they're running aren't going to be able to deal with. Alright, so moving forward, I want to touch on some of our bigger, mana cost spells that are going to ensure that the Ancient One's ability mills us for an adequate number. Because we don't want to, pay 4 mana to draw a card and then mill 3 cards, right? That's not going to get us to our threshold of 8 permanents. So the first one here is Fleet Swallower. It's 5 and 2 blue for a creature, fish, 6/6. Whenever it attacks, target player puts the top half of his or her library, rounded up, into his or her graveyard. Now this card is absolutely supposed to be used on your opponents. You are not supposed to be milling half of your own library. That can be crippling for most decks. For us though, if we've got a pretty healthy deck size, I say for that first attack, go for it. Mill yourself for half of your library. It's going to do exactly what you want to do all in one fell swoop, and it's 7 mana, so it's going to hit a ton of cards off of the Ancient One's ability. The next card here is Colossus of Akros. It's an 8 mana 10/10 artifact creature golem. Has Defender and Indestructible. You can also pay 10 for Monstrosity 10, meaning that you can put 10 +1/+1 counters on it and it becomes monstrous. And then once it is monstrous, it has trample and can attack as though it didn't have defender. So a lot of stuff going on here. Essentially the big thing is it's 8 mana. It's going to hit us for 8 cards off the Ancient One's ability. And if we get it on the field, it's a 10/10 indestructible blocker. Incredible. It's something that, again, could potentially win us games. It's going to dissuade a ton of attacks. I wish it had reach. I mean, if you look at the picture, this guy should absolutely have reach. That's really the only thing that's keeping it from being a perfect defender. But that monstrosity ability, yeah, if it's late game and you have 10 mana lying around and you can dump that into this, a 20/20 trampling indestructible creature is something that, again, could win the game on its own for you. In a way, it's a win con in of itself. And the last card in this section is the Wondrous Crucible. It's a 7 mana artifact, giving all of our permanents Ward 2. Love it. And at the beginning of your end step, you mill 2 cards. Love that too. Then exile non-land card at random from your graveyard. You copy it and cast it for free. Yeah, so everything on this card we love. The 7 mana cost, it's going to mill us for 7 with Ancient One's ability. Giving all of our permanents Ward 2, we love that. It's going to mill us at our end step, and it's going to get us a free spell on our end step, which for, again, this deck that we're running a ton of heavy hitters, we're going to potentially get a massive payoff off of this. Yeah, it's a card that you put it down and each individual ability isn't crazy, but the combination of which is really going to support your game plan and gonna propel you into the late game. Now, with a commander like the Ancient One, even though it's an 8/8, and you have to jump through certain hoops in order to attack with it, it's going to be a target for removal, as every commander is, right? It's essential to our strategy. Our opponents want us to not do the things we want to do, so we're going to try to get rid of it. And normally with commanders, right, you end up put them back in the command zone. The command tax gets a little high, gets a little more difficult to play as the game goes on. But because the Ancient One is only a 2 mana value creature, this is an opportunity for us to take advantage of some cards that really are not meant to be used on commanders. They're meant to be used on low to the ground combo creatures or creatures that have a minimal effect on the game, but cards that can pull the Ancient One right out of the graveyard and put it right back on the battlefield. So the first one here is Unearth. It's 1 black for a sorcery. You turn target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Super easy, hits the Ancient One. The next is Inscription of Ruin. It's 2 and a black for a sorcery. It has kicker, we're not going to worry about it, but you get to choose one mode. So either target opponent discards 2 cards, you return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, wink wink, or you destroy target creature with converted mana cost 3 or less. So a little bit more versatility here, costs a little bit more, but it does the exact same thing, where it's going to get your commander back out on the battlefield super cheap, but also gives you the versatility to potentially affect your opponents if you need it. And the last card here is Tempt with Immortality. It's 4 and a black for a sorcery. You return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Each opponent may return a creature card from his or her graveyard to the battlefield. For each player who does, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So the more famous Tempt card in this cycle is Tempt with Discovery, where it's the same exact thing but for ramping, right? You're getting a land out of your library. But this in our deck is going to be incredible, right? So we're getting something right off the bat. We're going to have some massive creatures in our graveyard that we'll be able to bring back for free. And then each opponent, maybe they need a combo piece. Maybe their commander's dead, and they need it back on the battlefield. And so we tempt them. Yeah, bring it back. It's all good. And then we come back with a Fleet Swallower or an Angel of Suffering or a Colossus Vakros. Cards that we're going to be able to have access to because, again, we're milling most of our library into our graveyard. And if it's harder to It's harder to kind of bluff your way with this because people know it's in your graveyard, so they know what they'll be facing if they choose to be tempted, but it's still a card that I think will have enough payoff. Even if you just get one extra creature out of this, paying 5 mana for 2 massive creatures is an incredible rate. Alright, and that brings us to the veggie portion of today's deck tech. As always, if you're running budget, you gotta eat your veggies. And that means including cards that will support and lubricate your strategy. Because you don't have access to some of the powerful, some of the high budget cards that these other players have access to that can kind of get around, if their deck isn't playing at an optimal level. And so I categorize those veggies as ramp, card draw, and removal. And so I want to go through some cards here that fit each of those strategies and will help us in our gameplay. So the first is Apprentice Wizard. It's 1 and 2 blue for a creature, human wizard, 0/1. You pay a blue, tap it, add 3 colorless. We've got a ton of high mana cost creatures with a lot of generic mana in their mana costs. So this is going to be super helpful. We get this out early, and we should be able to use this every single turn. It's just going to discount all of our big creatures, and even pay for a mana rock or 2 as we go along. The next is Millikin. It's 2 mana for an artifact creature construct. Tap it, mill a card, add a colorless. Very similar to the Deranged Assistant, basically the same ability. It does 2 things that we want in this deck. And then finally we got Hedron Archive. It's a 4 mana artifact. You tap to add 2, colorless, and then you pay 2 and tap it to sacrifice it and draw 2 cards. Easy peasy. And moving on to the next section here, I want to talk about some card draw. The first is Thought Scour. It's 1 blue for an instant. Target player, yourself, mills 2 cards, and then you draw a card. Easy peasy. For 1 mana, to get 2 cards in the graveyard and a card in your hand, it's a good card. The next is Atrocious Experiment. It's 2 and a black for a sorcery. Target player mills 2 cards, yourself, draws 2 cards, and loses 2 life. So again, gets cards in our graveyard, gets card in our hand. We love everything that this card does. And then finally we've got Pilfered Plans. It's 1 blue and a black for a sorcery. Target player, yourself, mills 2 cards and draws 2 cards. It's basically the same thing as Atrocious Experiment, except you're not losing the life, so maybe it's slightly better. But yeah, again, does the 2 things that we want. It's easy to pair the card draw with the milling, because usually that's seen as a downside. But in this case, we actually want to do it. Alright, and finally we're going to get into the removal category here. To start off, we've got Sinister Concoction. It's 1 black for an enchantment. You pay a black and pay a life. Put the top card of your library into your graveyard. Discard a card. Sacrifice Sinister Concoction. Destroy target creature. Alright, so we've got a lot going on for this ability. It's a 1 mana. We get it on the battlefield early. It's kind of like a loaded gun. But if you look through all the costs here, right? So you pay a black, pay 1 life, mill 1 card, and discard a card, and then sacrifice this thing, right? So mana and life, super normal. Not worried about that at all. Milling the card, usually seen as a downside. In our deck, it isn't. It's seen as a plus. And then discarding a card is probably the biggest downside here. But again, we're trying to tailor what's in our graveyard because we want to be able to get some of those things out. So if we get to choose which massive creature we get to put in there, there can be some upsides for that. So really everything here in terms of the payment is something that feeds into our deck strategy. So to be able to do all of that and still destroy, the biggest creature problem on the board is well worth the payoffs. Second card is River's Rebuke. It's 4 and 2 blue for a sorcery. You return all non-land permanents target player controls to their owner's hand. Beautiful. It's Cyclonic Thrift for 1 player. Excellent if you're down to a 1v1 situation, but even if it's a 2-on-1 and you're trying to take out the strongest player on the table, you get to River's Rebuke him, set him back a turn or 2, and you and the other player can finish him off before turning to each other. This is a super effective 1-player board wipe. and something that will win you games if used in the right setting. And then finally we've got Ashiok Dream Render. It's a 1 and 2 Dimir legendary planeswalker. Comes in with 5 loyalty to start. Spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause their controller to search their library. You're like, what does that do? That's not nothing. People don't search their library that much. Well, any kind of fetch land, turned off. Any kind of ramp spell, turned off. Any kind of tutor, turned off. And I think you'll be surprised at how much this slows down your opponent's game plan, because you're shutting off access to cards that they really want to play. And that's not even getting to her loyalty ability, which is a -1. Target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, most likely yourself, and then you exile each opponent's graveyard. So the exiling opponent's graveyard's maybe not super relevant unless someone else is playing a graveyard deck, but to be able to mill yourself consistently, even if you're not thinking about keeping Ashiok around long term, right? She's got no plus ability, she's going to die eventually, but if you're able to use that -1, 2, maybe 3 times before she gets taken out, that's 3 turns of value off her passive ability and 12 cards in the graveyard. So for 3 mana, this is something that's going to be a value machine for us. And that brings out the Thrift pick of this deck. Now, for those who haven't watched before, the Thrift pick is not the card that I think is the best in this deck. It is the card that I am most excited to play. So, the Thrift pick for this deck is the Bringer of the Last Gift. It's 6 and 2 black for a creature, vampire, demon, 6/6 with flying. When it enters the battlefield, if we cast it, each player sacrifices all other creatures they control. Then each player returns all creature cards from their graveyard that weren't put there this way to the battlefield. So this, it's an 8 mana card, so if you get it early game, discard it to Ancient One's ability, mill yourself for 8. Fits into the theme, absolutely. But the real power here, obviously, is, at turn 8, turn 9, you've got 40 cards in your graveyard. You cast this bad boy. It's a board wipe for everybody, but you're bringing back, 10, 12 heavy-hitting cards, creature cards onto the battlefield. And now you're going to have to potentially just wait and see what happens for a turn, and, it may not work out, but the splash index for this card is off the charts. I am so excited to see exactly how many creatures I can get out of this guy. Alright, and that brings us to the end of this deck tech. I hope you guys enjoyed. As always, if you thought of some cards that I forgot about, cards that you think work perfectly in this deck, let us all know down in the comments. Also, be sure to give this video a like, and if you're not already, please subscribe to the channel. And until next time, guys, stay thrifty.